She bought a house on credit and just wanted to make a good life for her kids. But in the yard, there was a secret that had been hidden underground for decades. Pulling on a rusty chain, she found a chest, and from that moment on, her life was never the same. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The house had never been hers until now. For years, Monica Rivers had lived in the shadow of other people's walls' apartments, where the paint peeled in corners, where neighbors shouted through thin partitions, where every month she handed over money for a roof that would never belong to her. She had dreamed of something else, something steady beneath her feet, a place her children could call their own. When the mortgage papers were signed, she felt as though she had won a battle no one thought she could fight. The house was cheap, old, and weather-beaten, but it was hers. The promise of ownership, of permanence, outweighed the leaking pipes and sagging walls. She told herself that one day her children would remember this as the moment their lives changed. Even if all she saw at first was dust, cracks, and endless work. The day she brought her children through the front door, they had run into the empty rooms with the kind of unrestrained joy only children know. Their laughter echoed against bare walls, filling spaces that had long stood hollow. Jaden, 10 years old, raced down the hall and staked his claim on a room with a cracked window, declaring it his territory before his younger sister Claire could argue. She, just 7, found a closet with a slanted ceiling and announced it would be her secret hideout. Monica stood in the doorway, her arms heavy from carrying boxes, but her heart lighter than it had been in years. This was the beginning of something she had almost given up hoping for. The house showed its age in every corner. The kitchen floor was worn smooth, as if countless footsteps had ground the boards down. The bathroom tiles were stained, and the pipes groaned whenever she turned on the faucet. In the living room, the wallpaper curled at the edges, revealing faded layers beneath, remnants of other lives lived before hers. Outside, the yard stretched wide, bordered by an old wooden fence that leaned precariously in places. The back lot was worse choked with weeds waist-high, scattered with debris, the collapsed bones of what might once have been a shed buried under thorn bushes. She knew it would take months, maybe years, to tame it. Yet as she stood there on that first afternoon, sweat on her forehead, the sound of her children's voices drifting through the air, she believed she could make it happen. The first weeks were a blur of exhaustion. Monica worked long hours at the grocery store and took cleaning jobs in the evenings. Each morning she rose before dawn, packing lunches, hustling the children off to school, then driving herself to the store where the fluorescent lights buzzed endlessly. At night, she came home to a house that needed her just as much as her jobs did. She scrubbed the walls, patched holes with plaster bought cheap at the hardware store, and coaxed life out of appliances that groaned in protest. Slowly, room by room, she carved away at the years of neglect. It was not beauty yet, but it was progress. Her children adapted with the resilience of youth. Jaden discovered the thrill of climbing the half-rotten tree in the backyard, while Claire found joy in gathering wildflowers that sprouted stubbornly among the weeds. Their laughter wove itself into the fabric of the house, softening its sharp edges. Monica, tired as she was, clung to these sounds as proof that she had made the right choice. Even when the bank statements came in the mail, their numbers reminding her of how steep a climb still lay ahead, she refused to believe she had erred. The house was not a burden, she told herself. It was a chance. It was on one of those rare weekends, when she allowed herself a morning away from extra work, that Monica turned her eyes to the backyard. The overgrowth had become more than an eyesore. It was a challenge to her determination. Armed with gloves and a shovel, she began pulling up weeds. her children nearby inventing games among the discarded planks of wood and broken bricks. The sun pressed down hot on her shoulders, and sweat dampened the collar of her shirt, but she welcomed the ache of labor. Each weed torn from the ground felt like a small victory, proof that she could bend this place to her will. It was then, as her shovel bit into the earth near the old fence, that she struck something hard. The sound was dull, metallic, not the scrape of stone, but the groan of iron against steel. At first, she thought it was only junk, a rusted nail or piece of fencing buried long ago. She bent closer, brushing away the dirt with her gloved hand, and saw the curve of a thick chain link glinting faintly in the sunlight. Confused, she pulled at it, expecting it to come free. But the chain resisted, as though anchored deep within the soil. Her children noticed her pause and came running. Jaden peered over her shoulder, his curiosity sharp, while Claire hung back, wide-eyed. Monica told them to stay clear as she dug more carefully, tracing the chain's path into the earth. Link by link, it revealed itself, caked in rust, each one fused by time and pressure. The chain was not small or light. It was heavy, thick, crafted for strength. It seemed out of place in a yard that should have held nothing more threatening than stones and roots. She followed its length with her shovel, her heart quickening despite herself. After several minutes of work, the blade struck something broader, flatter, the hollow thud of wood against steel. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. Kneeling in the dirt, she brushed away soil with her bare hands, revealing the edge of darkened wood, swollen and brittle from years underground. Her pulse thundered in her ears as the shape emerged, a corner reinforced with iron bands, each streaked orange with rust. It was a chest. The chain led directly to a metal ring fastened at the top, as if the box had been dragged or secured long ago. Monica sat back on her heels, staring at the object half buried before her. It was not a toy, not a forgotten tool. It was deliberate, placed there with intention, and hidden beneath decades of soil and growth. Her children stood silent now, sensing the gravity in their mother's stillness. The air felt heavier, the summer sun pressing down not only with heat, but with something else, a weight that settled in her chest. Monica's first thought was practical. Perhaps it was nothing more than a trunk of discarded belongings left behind by whoever had lived here before. Yet even as she tried to convince herself, a deeper unease stirred within her. The chain, the iron bands, the secrecy of its burial, all whispered of something more. She rose slowly, brushing dirt from her hands, and looked out across the yard. The weeds still stretched wild, the fence leaned tiredly, and her house loomed behind her, old and scarred. For weeks, she had seen it as only a project, something to fix, something to claim. But now, crouched beside the chest, Monica felt the ground shift beneath her in ways she could not explain. That night, after putting the children to bed, she sat by the kitchen window, staring out into the dark yard. The spot where the chain had surfaced seemed to pulse in her mind, an unanswered question she could not set aside. The old boards of the house creaked around her, and every sound carried a new echo, as if the walls themselves were remembering. She told herself it was nothing, that she would find out in the morning what truly lay beneath the earth. But in her heart, a restlessness had already taken root. The house, the yard, the soil itself seemed to be holding back a secret. And she knew, with a certainty that unsettled her, that once uncovered, it would change more than her plans for a garden. The night wore on slowly. She lay awake long after the children had drifted into sleep, her mind circling the same questions. What was buried beneath her new beginning? What had she stumbled upon in the soil she hoped would anchor her family's future? She did not yet know the answer, but she felt it waiting, patient and heavy, just beneath the surface. By morning, she would return to the spot with shovel and gloves. She would dig deeper, and the ground, silent for so many years, would finally begin to speak. The following morning arrived with a brightness that felt harsh, as though the sun itself were impatient for what lay beneath the earth to be revealed. Monica rose early, her body heavy from a night of restless thoughts, and stood for a long time at the kitchen window, staring at the corner of the yard, where the chain had glinted the day before. The children still slept, their soft breathing drifting from their rooms, but she could not wait. She slipped into her work clothes, pulled on her gloves, and walked out into the damp air that smelled of grass and earth. The spot seemed ordinary in the gray light. Just a patch of disturbed soil and weeds, but to her, it pulsed with significance. She began digging again, the shovel biting deeper into the stubborn ground. The metal edge clanged against iron, scraped against swollen wood, and slowly the rest of the chest came into view. Its shape was unmistakable now, a heavy wooden box reinforced with corroded bands. The wood was dark and spongy, swollen from decades of pressure, but it was intact. Monica's muscles ached as she pried at the soil around it, freeing its sides, following the stubborn links of the chain until at last she could clear away enough to tug it upward. With every heave, the chest resisted, as though reluctant to surrender its secrets. But finally, it rose with a sucking sound from the earth and settled onto the grass in front of her. The children awoke while she worked and came running barefoot into the yard, their eyes wide at the sight of the chest. To them, it looked like something out of an adventure story, a pirate's treasure, or a buried trunk of gold. They buzzed with excitement, but Monica felt none of their lightness. The chest was heavy not only in weight, but in presence, radiating an unease that settled deep in her bones. She told the children to keep their distance, their laughter dimming into wary silence as they watched her. The lock had long ago corroded, the clasp little more than a lump of orange rust. She braced the shovel under its edge and pried. The brittle wood groaned, splintering in places until with one sharp crack, the lid gave way. A breath of stale air rose from inside, thick with the smell of rot and time. Monica hesitated, her hands trembling as she lifted the lid wider, then froze as her eyes adjusted to the shadowy contents. Inside, half buried in dirt and fragments of cloth, lay objects that made her recoil. Rusted shackles coiled upon themselves like sleeping serpents, their circular bands still unmistakable in shape. Chains lay tangled, their links fused by time but still intact. She reached out to spite herself and lifted one of the cuffs, startled by its weight. The iron was cold and unyielding, heavy in her palm. For a moment, she imagined the feel of it clamped around living flesh, the ring cutting into skin, and she dropped it back into the chest as if burned. The metallic clank rang out in the morning air, startling the children and echoing too loudly in her ears. Beneath the pile of rusted iron was something else. Monica brushed aside debris and pulled free a bundle of papers wrapped in the brittle remains of oiled cloth. Her breath caught as she unfolded them, her fingers careful on the fragile edges. The ink had faded, but the words were still legible. Names filled the pages in neat cursive, each one followed by numbers and remarks. Some were crossed out, others carried short notes. Sold, escaped, dead. Her stomach knotted as she realized what she held. These were not random papers. They were records, inventory of human lives reduced to transactions. She turned to another page and found lists of ages, places, amounts of money scrawled beside them. A heaviness pressed down on her chest as she read. She did not want to see more, but her hands moved anyway, compelled by something beyond curiosity. In another bundle she found letters, written hurriedly, the words cramped, as though the writer had been in fear. They spoke of men searching the countryside, of hounds and patrols, of routes north, of hidden barns and fields where food and shelter could be found. The letters carried no names of senders, only the urgency of those who had risked everything to write them. The world around Monica seemed to still as she sat in the grass with the chest before her. The children's voices blurred in the background. She could see, as if superimposed upon her own yard, figures moving in the night. Their footsteps quick, their breaths harsh, chains rattling or broken, eyes darting toward the shadows in search of refuge. She saw men dragging the chest, burying it, hiding it from discovery. She saw women and children pressed into silence, their bodies bent beneath the weight of fear. And she saw her own hands now holding what had been left behind, evidence of suffering that the ground itself had guarded all these years. She gathered the papers back into their wrapping and placed them carefully on the table inside the house, then returned to the chest, staring at it as though it might move on its own. The shackles seemed alive in her memory. Their shapes burned into her mind. Every sound in the room was amplified, the creak of the floorboards, the whisper of the breeze through the broken screen door, until it felt as though the walls themselves were listening. That night, she could not eat. The children begged her for stories of treasure, but she could not give them the answers they sought. Instead, she tucked them into bed and sat alone at the kitchen table, the bundle of papers spread before her. She read until her eyes blurred, absorbing the lists of names, the brief, cruel remarks, the hurried lines of letters. The weight of it pressed against her chest like an invisible stone. She thought of the years she had fought just to keep her family afloat, the debts, the exhaustion, the hope that this house would bring a new beginning. Now it seemed her new beginning had been built on ground that remembered something much older, something darker. As the hours stretched into night, she imagined the lives behind the names. Each one was a story that had been reduced to a word on a page. She thought of mothers clutching their children, of men fleeing into the night, of footsteps pressing into the same soil her children now played upon. The thought filled her with dread, but also with a strange sense of responsibility. She could not unsee what she had found, could not bury it again, and pretend it had never been there. The walls of the house felt closer than ever, the air thick with unspoken voices. She tried to imagine her father's voice, her mother's laughter, anything to anchor herself. But the weight of history was stronger. She sat for hours, turning the papers over and over, until at last the first light of dawn slipped through the window. Her eyes burned from lack of sleep. But she knew one thing with certainty. She had unearthed something that was not meant to stay hidden. The chest in her yard was not just an object. It was a message, and it had chosen her to uncover it. By morning, the ordinary rhythm of life seemed far away. She fed the children, walked through the rooms of the house, tried to lose herself in the tasks of cleaning and repair. But everywhere she looked, the weight of what she had found intruded. The creak of the floor was no longer just the sound of old wood. It was the echo of history. The soil outside was no longer just a yard to be cleared. It was ground that had hidden voices. She had bought the house to find security, but instead, she had uncovered something that tied her to a legacy she could neither ignore nor fully understand. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned orange over the roof lines, Monica stood once again at the spot where she had unearthed the chest. The earth was scarred from her digging, the grass bent and trampled, but the air was quiet. She closed her eyes and listened. In that silence, she felt the presence of those who had come before, whose lives had been bound to this soil. She felt the past pressing against her, heavy and undeniable. She did not yet know what she would do with it, but she knew that her life, her children's lives, and even the meaning of the house itself had already changed. The ground had spoken, and it would not be silenced again. The days that followed passed in a haze, as if time itself had shifted since the moment Monica unearthed the chest. She could not look at her home in the same way anymore. What once had been just an aging house bought with desperation now felt charged with memory, carrying with it the weight of lives that had crossed through its soil long before she and her children arrived. The chest sat in her kitchen, its wood crumbling, its contents spread carefully across the table. Every time she walked past, she felt its presence tug at her, reminding her that the discovery had changed not only her sense of place, but also her sense of herself. She tried to focus on ordinary routines. Each morning she woke the children, prepared simple breakfasts, and sent them off to school. She folded laundry, swept the floors, and patched up corners of the house, still demanding repair. Yet nothing felt ordinary. Even when she forced herself to scrub at stains or mend a broken hinge, her eyes would stray toward the table, toward the shackles piled in their rusted heap, toward the fragile papers that trembled at the slightest movement. Her hands, roughened from years of labor, trembled whenever she picked them up, afraid she might destroy them, yet unable to keep from touching them again and again. The names haunted her most. She had read them aloud in a whisper, her voice trembling as though speaking them could call the people back into existence. Each was accompanied by notations that reduced a human being to a transaction, a loss, or a disappearance. Some had been marked as sold, others as dead, a few as escaped. The words were blunt, unfeeling, yet in her mind, she could not help but imagine the faces, the hands, the voices behind them. They became ghosts in her imagination, pressing against the silence of the house until she could feel them near. At night, she found no rest. When the children had fallen asleep, she lay awake, listening to the shifting sounds of the old house. The creak of a floorboard made her think of footsteps long past. The rustle of wind through the broken fence conjured whispers she could not quite understand. She felt as though she was sharing her home with countless unseen presences, not malevolent, but insistent, pressing her to acknowledge them. The land she had bought was no longer only hers, it was theirs too. Fear tangled itself with responsibility. She thought of the mortgage papers stacked in her drawer, of the debt that hung over her head like a storm cloud. If she told anyone of the discovery, if historians or officials came, the land might be claimed for preservation. She might lose everything she had fought to gain. The idea made her chest tighten with panic. This house had been her desperate gamble, her last chance at stability, and she could not imagine giving it up. Yet the thought of burying the chest again, of pretending she had never found it, filled her with shame. To silence it would be to silence the lives it represented, to bury their memory again beneath the soil. Her children sensed her turmoil, even if they didn't understand its depth. They asked innocent questions, hoping she might spin tales of treasure or hidden fortune, but her answers were quiet and evasive. Still, they saw how she lingered over the papers, how her expression darkened with sorrow and worry. Jaden sometimes tried to make her laugh, hoping to ease the heaviness he could feel in her, but she smiled only briefly before sinking back into silence. Claire grew more cautious, tiptoeing around her mother as if afraid to disturb her. Their young eyes watched closely, absorbing the weight of the moment, even if they could not yet name it. One afternoon, when the sun was setting and painting the sky in streaks of crimson, Monica carried the shackles out to the porch and held them in her lap. They were colder than the air around her, heavier than she expected each time she lifted them. She turned one over in her hands, tracing the rough edges where iron had eaten into itself over decades of corrosion. She imagined again what it might have been like for someone to wear it, for it to close around a wrist or an ankle, a constant reminder of captivity. The thought sickened her, yet she forced herself to hold the iron longer, as though to bear witness through touch alone. She thought of her own struggles, the endless labor, the debts, the weariness that clung to her every day. Yet all of it seemed small compared to the voices of those who had been chained, those whose names now whispered from the fragile papers. Her hardship was real, but it was not the same. What she had found was a story of survival, of suffering beyond her own imagination, and she knew that the ground beneath her feet had carried it long before she arrived. The conflict inside her grew sharper with each passing day. Some mornings, she convinced herself that silence was best, that protecting her children and her fragile new stability mattered more than anything else. But then she would look again at the names, at the desperate lines in the letters, and shame would flood her. To ignore them was to betray them. She realized she was standing at a crossroads, one that demanded not only courage, but sacrifice. One evening, after another sleepless night, she made her decision. She would not bury the truth again. She would find a way to share what she had discovered, even if it meant risking the home she had fought so hard to gain. She thought of her children, of the example she wanted to set for them. She wanted them to grow up knowing that truth mattered, that the voices of the forgotten should never be silenced, that sometimes the greatest act of love was to carry a burden that belonged to many, not just yourself. The next morning she gathered the papers and set them carefully into a box, wrapping them to keep them safe. She did not know yet whom she would contact, whether a local historian, a teacher, or perhaps a university in the nearest city. But she knew she would not keep this to herself. She looked at the children, who sat eating breakfast with wide eyes, sensing that something important had shifted. She did not tell them everything, but in her heart, she believed they already understood, more than their years suggested. Later that evening, she stepped once more into the yard, the air cool and quiet, the soil still scarred from where she had dug. She stood at the place where the chain had first surfaced and stared down at it. The ground seemed ordinary, no different from any other patch of dirt, yet to her it had become sacred. She whispered softly, not to the children playing inside, not even to herself, but to the unseen lives tied forever to the soil. She promised she would not bury them again. She promised she would let their story be heard. As she turned back toward the house, the lights glowing faintly in the windows, she felt a strange calm settle over her. The house was no longer only a home built of wood and plaster, no longer just her gamble for survival. It was a place of remembrance, a witness to history that had waited silently until she arrived. She had not sought this role, but it had found her, and she could no longer turn away. The house spoke now, not in words, but in the weight of its silence, in the voices hidden in its soil, in the iron and paper she had drawn from the ground. And Monica knew she would carry that voice forward, no matter the cost. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Take a moment to watch the next video waiting for you right now. There are many more stories worth discovering. And don't forget to share this video with friends and family. Some stories are too powerful to keep to yourself.